Well, hello zonographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. We've looked at a lot of 85mm vintage lenses on this channel, from left field choices like the Helios 40, budget choices like the very capable Jupiter 9, to more exotic and expensive choices like the Olympus Zuiko 85mm f2. Well, today there's a new kid on the block, the Zeiss Jena Pancolar 80mm f1.8, and we're going to test it and compare it with vintage 85s from Nikon, Helios, Jupiter, Olympus and Pentax, and we'll be asking the question, which is the best value vintage 85? Like most 85s I've used, the CZJ lens is actually fairly small. It's not much bigger than a 50mm, though it's quite a bit heavier than most. It focuses down to 85 centimeters and the focus throw is just over 180 degrees. The focus ring turns smoothly, although there is a slightly rough spot at minimum focus distance. Eventually it'll need a service, but it's more than usable for now. Apertures run from f1.8 to f16. There are half stop adjustments between stops. The aperture ring turns nice and cleanly, and there are 6 aperture blades on this lens. From wide open, this lens is incredibly sharp. I think it's slightly sharper than the Olympus and the Pentax, themselves both very sharp lenses, and it's just a whisker sharper, as far as I can see, than the razor sharp Pentax 50mm f4 macro, making this the sharpest vintage lens I've ever tested. Quite an accolade. The level of detail resolved in these images is quite astonishing. It's so sharp it rivals many modern lenses. Sides, top and bottom of the frame seem equally as sharp as the centre, and there's a little fall off in the corners, but not so much. Stopping down to f4 sharpens things up even more, though pushing on to f8 seems to soften the image slightly, so f4's the sweet spot for maximum sharpness. But when a lens is this sharp wide open, why bother stopping down at all? Like the Pentax and the Olympus, this is a lens you can shoot wide open and still get very near maximum sharpness with maximum background blur too. And while the Pentax and Olympus lenses are very sharp, I don't think they're quite as sharp as the Pancolar. In terms of sharpness, the Nikon 85mm f2 lags a little behind the Pentax, Olympus and Pancolar, but only a little. It doesn't resolve quite as much detail fully open, although it's still a sharp lens and images certainly don't look soft. Nevertheless, sharpness improves considerably if you stop down to f4. Like the Pancolar though, it begins to soften if you go to f8, so again f4 is the sweet spot. The Jupiter 9 85mm f2 isn't quite in the same league when it comes to sharpness. It's entirely sharp enough, but it lacks the fully open razor sharpness of the Olympus, the Pentax and certainly of the Pancolar, and it's a bit less sharp than the Nikon too. Now, I've shot this lens a lot. I like its aesthetic, and for me, sharpness isn't the first priority. Stopping down to f4 sharpens it up a lot, push on to f8 and it sharpens up even more to a point where it matches the other lenses, but even so, this is not a lens that you can shoot wide open and get maximum or near maximum sharpness. The Helios 40 85mm f1.5 is the least sharp of the bunch, at least wide open, and that's not surprising given its fast aperture and its roots as a copy of a 1930s Zeiss design. At f1.5, this lens is clearly a little soft. It's not awful, but it's obviously soft, and in the corners it's even softer. That leads many to dismiss it, but to do that is to miss the point. This is an art lens with a very unique and unusual look, and it does sharpen up a lot if you stop it down. Nevertheless, like the Jupiter, this lens can't be shot wide open and give maximum sharpness, or, indeed, anywhere near it. In terms of colour rendition, the Pancolar is, to my eye at least, a real stunner. It's one of the nicest, perhaps the nicest lenses I've ever shot in this regard. It's a warmish lens and everything is suffused with a slight golden glow. Colours are full and rich, vibrant and living, with a wonderful body and richness, helped by the lens's inherently strong contrast. Colours are entirely in keeping with those from its little brother, the Pancolar 50mm f1.8. With the exception of that lens though, I've never seen colours like these. They're unique to Zeiss Jena, and the Pancolars are sought after by photographers and filmmakers alike for their stunning colour representation. And just as colour shots are impressive, so are black and whites too. It makes very rich, full-blooded monochrome shots that remind me of a high-contrast film. These images have real atmosphere. Everything is represented in very solid, highly detailed shades of light and dark, with solid silver in between. In both colour and black and white, this lens makes spectacular images. The Olympus 85mm f2 is a cooler lens that nevertheless has stunning colours, high in saturation and definition. This lens loves colour and it paints its colours big and bold. It's not as saturated as some lenses, the Helios 40 for example, but the Zuiko has a very nicely balanced colour profile, stepping back before the point where colours might seem too intense. Other Pentax lenses I've used have shared a very distinct and uniform look when it comes to colour, medium saturation, with a gentle, delicate, almost pastel rendering of colour, not unlike the Jupiter 9 in fact. But this 85mm lens takes a different approach. It's bolder and more direct, much less restrained. Colours are solid and strong, intense and powerful. It's a similar look to the Zeiss Pancolar and quite different to the Olympus. It's difficult to put a hair between the Pancolar and the Pentax in the matter of colour. If anything, I slightly prefer the colours from the Pancolar, and I slightly prefer both of them to the Olympus. The Nikon AI 85mm f2 is another cool lens, emphasising the blue end of the spectrum rather than the red. It has a very distinctive colour signature that several AI lenses I've tested share. There's plenty of saturation and colours are exuberant, but there's a delicacy too, a restraint and a subtlety that lends a certain calmness to images. There's a balance to this lens that means its strong colours never become overpowering. The Jupiter 9 has beautiful colour rendition, rather more delicate and subtle than the other lenses here. Colours do have an intensity, but it's a delicate intensity with a soft pastel quality that's unusual and very pleasing. The only look I can compare it to is that of the Pentax Takumars, but I think it's a bit nicer than that. It's a very unusual, very distinctive look, and a very beautiful one too. It's worth mentioning what this lens does with black and white too. It's quite special, and it's actually one of my favourite black and white lenses. Its images have a silvery quality that remind me of low contrast film, and it works very nicely in video too. When it comes to colours, the Helios 40 is in a league of its own. This lens delivers the most saturated colours I've seen from any lens, bar none. Some have come close, but none give quite the same saturation as this one. Every shot taken with this lens pumps up colours to the max. The lens has a magical quality, entirely appropriate to an art lens. It's a lens that makes shots with what I can only call magical reality. Through it, the whole world looks exuberant, colourful, a very different portrayal than a more gritty and realistic lens might make. These are fast, longish lenses, so they'll all give plenty of background blur, and they'll separate the subject from the background even at longer distances. That said, the nature and quality of the blur differs a lot between lenses, and some are definitely nicer than others in this regard. The Zeiss Jena lens makes some very beautiful blur that gives images a real dreamy sort of feel. This blur is soft, beautiful and lovely. Up close it's very big and very soft, and at longer distances we still get separation, helped by the lens's inherent sharpness. And both background and foreground are covered with a beautiful soft wash of colour, reminiscent of an impressionist painting. It's not soft quite all the way though, and at certain distances a little roughness can creep in, and the lens does get a little harsh at those points. It's easy to shoot around, but it has to be said that this lens is not smooth all the way, at least not quite. The character of the blur from the Olympus lens is very pleasing. It's big and soft at the minimum focus distance of 85 centimeters, but the real test comes as camera, subject and background distances change relative to each other, and harshness might creep in as the character of the blur changes. That's not the case with this lens though, because whatever you do with it, however you change the relationship of camera, subject and background, blur never becomes unpleasant. Certainly it changes in intensity and in character, and it can become less smooth, but it never acquires the harsh, jittery, nervous sort of feel that can emerge in other lenses, and it never detracts from a shot. This one is lovely all the way. The Pentax lens certainly won't disappoint when it comes to blur. Close to the subject, it is of course considerable, and it's very smooth too. Forms and shapes melt away completely, leaving a big blurry wash, and as camera, subject and background distances change, that smoothness remains. Like the Olympus, this lens cannot be phased, and background blur remains smooth. In fact, I think it's a little bit smoother than the Olympus, and a little bit nicer too. The Nikon 85 gives us plenty of blur too, and it's mostly well controlled, but not quite as well controlled as the Pancolar, and certainly not as well controlled as the Olympus and the Pentax. Close to the subject, blur is massive and super soft. As camera, background and subject distances change, much of the time it's smooth and pleasing, but occasionally it does show some harshness, which can detract from a shot and makes it less pleasing than it otherwise might be. The Jupiter 9 gives us plenty of blur too, and its sonar-derived design means it gives a classic sonar signature with plenty of beautiful bubbles from point light sources in the background. Blur is generally very soft, but this is essentially a 1930s design, and it doesn't hold up quite as well as its more modern counterparts. Harshness creeps in a bit more often, but it's not difficult to shoot around, and once you're familiar with it and learn its foibles, you can make some very beautiful images indeed with this lens. The Helios 40, when it comes to blur, is, once more, in a league of its own. This lens is prized by stills photographers and movie makers alike because it renders background blur like no other lens, at least no other lens that I know of. With the right background, usually a natural one, and the right combination of distances, it gives a very pronounced swirl effect in the back of a shot, an effect loved by many and, it must be said, hated by probably as many others. If you're a fan of the swirly stuff though, this one will deliver more of it, more consistently than any other lens I know. Stopping down reduces this effect, and it is very dependent on distance anyway. But if you want a really distinctive lens with blur unlike any other, this could well be the lens for you. So which of these lenses is the best value? Which is the one for you? There's a range of prices here, so I'm going to separate them into two groups: inexpensive, below £250, and more expensive, £250 and over. In the more expensive group, we have the very rare and very wonderful Zeiss Jena Pancolar 80mm f1.8. It has beautiful colours, great contrast, strong and punchy black and whites. It's got some of the nicest blur I've ever seen. It's extremely sharp wide open, and it costs, if you can find one, somewhere between £600 and £700. Not the cheapest lens here, and because of this high price tag, it's not the best value lens in this group, although it is a beautiful optic. We also have the Helios 40, an incredibly characterful lens with fantastic colour rendition, some very unusual and unique background blur, and a price tag of around £300. It's an incredible and unusual lens, but it is an art lens, and a pretty heavy one too, which, because of its aesthetic and its weight, is probably one for occasional use only. So for that reason, it's not the best value lens in this group. Then we have the Olympus 85mm f2, a beautifully made lens with very nice colour, outstanding sharpness, very nice background blur, and a price tag of between £250 to £300. This lens was very nearly the winner in this group, but I marginally prefer the colour and the background blur of the remaining lens, which means that the best value 85mm lens in the more expensive group is the Pentax 85mm f1.8. It's a beautiful lens, exquisitely manufactured, very sharp from wide open, with very nice, very well controlled background blur. Its images are very, very nearly as nice as those from the Pancolar, but at around £250 to £300 or thereabouts, it's about half the price. For what it is, this lens is outstanding value. But we still have two very nice lenses to go in the less expensive group, the Nikon 85mm f2 and the Jupiter 9 85mm f2. The Nikon lens is really nice. It's extremely well made. It has good sharpness and great colour rendition and very nice background blur too. In fact, this lens does almost as much as its more expensive brethren, and you can find them for around £80 to £100. But the Jupiter's a lovely lens as well. It's very well made, it's reasonably sharp or engagingly soft, depending on how you like to put it. It has a unique and pleasing colour palette. It's got the sonar look, which I like very much, and it has a 15 blade aperture, more than any other lens on test today. Plus, I do marginally prefer its images, so I'm going to say that the Jupiter 9 at around £100 is the best value 85mm lens in this less expensive group. So there we are, 6 fantastic 85mm lenses. I've made my choice for the 2 best value ones. You may or may not agree, but whichever you choose, they'll all make some beautiful and characterful images, and all of them are a joy to use. So that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go. And if you'd like to support this channel and help it to develop and grow, you can do so at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.